So in 2012, a European consortium of countries from Portugal, Spain, France and the UK set up this amazing latitudinal gradient of about 38 experiments. And this latitudinal gradient stretched from the Azores in Portugal all the way up to the island of Mull in Scotland. And the idea here was to plant out many species and multiple provenances from those species at each of these 38 sites across this latitudinal gradient. And that will allow us to see which species are maybe performing well under current climates and which species might also be well adapted to future climates, and to kind of get a flavour for whether there's also any differences between provenances of those species to help us adapt our productive forests to a changing climate. So to complement this latitudinal gradient of experiments, in 2012 Forest Research set up 5 additional kind of sister experiments to the 3 of these experiments that we already had in the UK. And the idea here was to focus in on slightly less species, but those which we thought might be most sort of well aligned to adapting our forests to a changing climate. So the focus of this paper was to effectively take the first 6 years of data that's been collected from these experiments, quality control check everything, and then have a bit of a snapshot understanding about which species are performing really well in terms of their survival and initial height growth relative to each other across all 5 of these different experiments. So some of the species we included in the experiments will be familiar to most people and are sort of classically productive species in the UK already. So where it was appropriate to do so, we included Sitka spruce, and that's useful because it allows us to then compare the growth and survival rates of other species to that commonly planted species. Also, because these experiments were planted in 2012, larch was also included, so 2 different types of larch. And there was also Douglas fir was included as another species which is kind of expected to be quite a good candidate for productive forestry in the UK across some sites. To complement these were some slightly other peculiar species. So we had Atlantic cedar in there, and we also had Japanese cedar. We also had some other spruces like oriental spruce, and we saw a real range of performance between these different species, which kind of demonstrates the importance of including a full variety of different species in the trials, but also in trialling these species across a range of different site conditions, because the relative ranking of some of these species changed depending on what site you were at. So we saw quite clear evidence of some real winners and losers. So as might be expected, the larch species did incredibly well, as did many of the pine species, particularly on the drier sites. Whereas Douglas fir did really well on at least some of the wetter sites, sometimes better than some of the pine species, and also kept pace with Sitka spruce where it was planted at the same site. So this is quite useful information because obviously it allows us to compare what the most commonly productive species is on the wetter sites with the species which is classically more planted on sheltered and sort of slightly more fertile sites than Sitka might be. One of the interesting things about Douglas fir is that in its native range it occurs with Sitka spruce. And so some of the real opportunities for the future, I think personally, are to investigate how Sitka spruce and Douglas fir grow together in intimate mixtures, or at least in group mixtures. And this hasn't really been done a great deal in the UK, surprisingly, to date. But I think it's a real opportunity for the future to see whether productivity gains can be brought about by mixing these 2 species. Some of the species that didn't perform so well, or at least showed very poor initial height growth and survival, were the Atlantic cedar and the oriental spruce. So Atlantic cedar showed really high rates of mortality across most sites, which was kind of to be expected considering what its natural distribution is from much warmer climates than ours. The oriental spruce showed quite good survival, but incredibly slow above ground height growth. And so even now we've only analysed the 6-year data, but we've been back to these experiments since, and many of these trees are still only below 2 meters high. And so it kind of implies that the oriental spruce is going to be very slow to establish, which in turn means that it will require much more protection for much longer. So it might not be one of the best species placed to adapt UK forestry to a changing climate. One of the great hopes from these experiments, both now from this kind of preliminary initial analysis during establishment and sort of as these experiments continue to mature through time, is that they'll provide us with the evidence to understand how different species are performing relative to one another across a range of site conditions, and therefore which species might be best placed to diversify our limited portfolio of productive, particularly conifer species, to a changing climate.